So Dr. Pearl Bylund is Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. He is also a fellow of the Mises Institute, which tells you that he is a legitimate Austrian scholar and an associated scholar with the Ratio Institute in Sweden. Dr. Bylund serves as Associate Editor of the Journal of Entrepreneurship and Public Policy and the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. His research focuses on entrepreneurship as the value creative driving force of the market process. That's very Karl Mengerin, as I was telling you about, right? The effect of regulations, which I think most Austrians believe should be least as possible, and Austrian Economics, and he's published in top entrepreneurship and management journals. He's also the author of 2 books. I think it's more than 2, but those 2, and he can tell you more about the books he's written. And he's also, I'm told, working on a primer on Austrian economics that will be available to people who want to learn about Austrian economics. Is that correct?
That is correct. And we are hoping to publish this in the fall.
Perfect. Thank you. And let me start with the first question now. How did you get interested in entrepreneurship research? How did you decide to become a business scholar and do entrepreneurship research?
Well, that's a short question with a very long answer. So I started out really in IT, which seems to have no connection at all. But then while I was working in the IT sector, I was involved in politics and I got a master's in political science. And I was interested in the philosophy of society and understand how come society works the way it works, and how come we have this type of standard of living and these cultures and everything that we're seeing today. It's very different from what it was like 100 years ago, and it's very different in different places as well. And then I quit my career and headed for academia on my wife's advice. Always trust your wife, right? And I managed to get into an economics PhD program, which was not super planned. But going from in IT or computer science to political theory or political philosophy to economics, obviously my interest in society sort of got an economics twist, if you will. And being an Austrian economist too, studying the marketplace as a dynamic place, as a process that is always evolving and changing, it became pretty obvious that the driving force in this, both in the economy itself and for society, is this change agent, the entrepreneur. So I had to try to understand what entrepreneurs do and what entrepreneurship is. And it's much more than simply starting a business. I mean, that's easy to say, but then what the heck does that actually mean in terms of our wealth, our standard of living? What does that mean in terms of our culture? And what does it mean if someone has disruptive ideas and changes the economy, but it's just another business? So I really started out in my grad program in the theory of the firm. So I developed a new theory of the firm based on sort of Austrian principles, with the entrepreneur in the middle, in the economic process, trying to figure out how the economy sort of grows beyond the extent of the market, as is usually a limitation since Adam Smith. So coming from there, it became obvious to me that entrepreneurship is so much more than simply the organization, the firm. And in order to understand where we are, where we're headed, where we came from, what society is like, we need to understand entrepreneurship. So I dug into that, and I'm still digging.
Well, yeah. And Andrea does have a comment for you in the chat box, but we'll come to that comment later. I'll move on with my second question, which is, can you briefly share with us the trajectory from origin to publication of one of your Austrian economics entrepreneurship paper? Any paper you can pick.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about a recently published paper in Small Business Economics, which I have co-authored with Mark Packard at University of Nevada. The title is Subjective Value in Entrepreneurship, and it really introduces in a sense, a fundamental assumption in economics that value is subjective, meaning simply that we're all trying to attain a better way of life. We're trying to satisfy our own wants, whatever they might be. And what exactly those wants are, we can't really say. How much we value certain wants over others, we can't really say either. All of this is sort of a little bit up in the air. And all of economics sort of recognizes this and has done since 1871 at least, even though economists today have sort of turned their backs on this. So they try to put everything in mathematical formulas. So we wanted to bring this view to entrepreneurship and introduce entrepreneurship scholars to this sort of fundamental assumption that it's really should be a fundamental assumption for all social sciences, that people are people make decisions, but people make decisions from their own perspective. It's really not a very radical thought, but it's something that every time we do research, we sort of skip that part, which is very strange. You can't really have a science and do scholarship based on an assumption that you sort of know is false, the way we do it today. So it's sort of starting a battle or taking the next step in a battle between subjectivist and objectivist value. Of course, you can translate and sort of make shortcuts going into profit and talk about the money value of profit and so forth, and thereby sort of take that shortcut and make it possible to study data and just say, oh, never mind people, we'll just study businesses and whatever. But I think that in order to actually understand what the heck we're doing and what we're actually studying, we need to recognize that value is subjective. And I heard that you mentioned that before. Lachman was really big on subjective value and radical subjectivism. And we think that entrepreneurship scholars need to at least be aware of this and even better adopt this view. It doesn't necessarily change a whole lot in empirical research, but it does change how we develop our theories, and it makes all theories sort of better grounded philosophically. So more true.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you found your co-authors, how you went through the review process? I'm assuming it wasn't like, you submitted the paper and they said, wonderful, here is the acceptance letter.
Yeah, I wish that were the case, but that seems to never happen. No, right. So the co-author, Mark and I, we have written a lot together for a long time, and I actually met him in grad school. So, I mean, friends, that's really our capital in a sense in this business. So knowing people and then figuring out who you can work with well. I mean, I've had other co-authors where they promise and don't deliver, and I'm sure you have had the same experience, right? And some of them, they sit on a paper and they say that they have sort of done half of what they wanted to do, and then 3 years later you're still poking them and nothing happens, and that paper is dead. It's simply because, well, they have done something and they killed it because it's in a drawer, or it used to be in the drawer now, and it's on a hard drive somewhere, if they even remember that there is a paper. And others you learn that you work really well with. So Mark and I work really well with each other, and we're really fast. So in a sense, we shoot the paper in a Word document back and forth pretty much every day, and we add content to it. So we can produce a fairly good paper in a month's time, say, something like that. Oh. But so I mean, finding those friends that's a very good start. And co-authoring papers, I totally recommend that, because it's so much easier than writing something yourself. So I published a paper myself in Journal of Management Studies just after grad school, and that was a horrible experience because I was alone. So I needed to respond to reviewers myself. I got friends, I got help from senior colleagues and everything. but still it was 5 rounds of complete rewrites, which took forever and was a lot of work. And of course, every time I wondered something, or every time I did something that was not completely accurate, no one could help me figure it out, right? So just that, co-authoring with someone does not mean splitting the work 50-50. It means you're doing 30%, the other guy is doing 30%, and that's 100% somehow, right? So doing it yourself means you're doing a lot more work. So co-authors, that's one. This paper, since it is a little provocative, it has been going around and tried some journals in different shapes, of course, getting an R&R and whatever, a little here and there in several journals. I think, I can't recall which ones, but I'm sure we tried AMR and JBV and so forth. And I don't think we got any desk rejects, which would be, that's a victory in itself. But we also didn't get any R&Rs that weren't super high risk. And this, the argument needed to be refined over and over again, because it assumed that the reader and the reviewer knew more than they actually knew. And of course, it's a matter of friends here too. I mean, it's not friends is not only about co-authoring with someone, but it's also about knowing the editor so that you get good reviewers. So the editor knows where you're coming from, so that they will assign reviewers who know where you're coming from too. So of course, we had a lot of experience with reviewers who had no clue what we were talking about. And those reviewers are not going to accept the paper. There is no way. And the same thing, of course, if you have enemies and they happen to be a reviewer, then they will find errors with your paper no matter what. So it's again about having friends. But I mean, this paper has been going around for a couple of years probably. We have revised it over and over again in response to reviewers' comments, and every time we get a rejection, we've been lucky to get rejections from top journals. So the editor has actually spent some time discussing what the reviewers and what the editor found to be lacking with the paper, which means you get really good feedback, and you can take that with you and rewrite the paper, which is pretty much what you need to do, right? And then we were lucky to get to Small Business Economics with a friendly editor who saw what we were going to do and saw the potential in the paper. And then it was, I think it might have been 2 rounds with really good, well-informed reviewers. So, I mean, a paper that finds a journal with an editor and reviewers that know what you're talking about, that's a fast process. Submitting a paper out of nowhere to a journal where the editor doesn't quite know what you're doing, you're going to get reviewers who don't know what you're doing. That's a very fast process too, but it's a reject.
Yep.
Right.
And go ahead.
No, I mean, that's basically what you have to deal with. You have to make sure that people know what you're talking about and where you're going with it and why what you're doing is important.
And Per, I never told you this, but I was very happy to see when that paper came out, because in my first year of the PhD program, I tried to write about how the notion of value in RBV was very vague, and how Austrian economics can help us understand subjective value. But I could never get the ideas work out coherently, because I was so new in the program. And then, of course, with everything else, it fell by the wayside. So 19 years later, I see your paper come out and I go, this is the paper I wanted to write 19 years ago. So finally, somebody wrote it. So
basically 19 years later, I beat you to
it. Yes, and thank you very much for doing that. But I think the field needed that paper, and I think it can make a contribution, not just to entrepreneurship, but also to resource-based view, where the idea of value remains sort of fuzzy.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's sort of intentionally fuzzy. I don't mean that Jay Barney and others have kept it fuzzy, but people have not addressed it, because that's opening Pandora's box, right? And in a sense, it is based on simply a tautology, right? That resources are valuable, and that's just assumed. And then you set out to capture those resources that are valuable because if they are also rare, no one else can get a valuable resource, and there you go, profits. And that's a way too simplified, right? If you want to study the economy.
Right. So I know we have many students, many participants who are raising their hand, but I do want to get through the 4 questions I have. So the third question is, as a reviewer and editor, what do you look for in a paper? How do you decide if a paper has potential or not?
Yeah, for me, it's definitely the so what question. So Jay Barney has this structure for an introduction, which is, I think it's really, really helpful. I think he refers to it as ABCD. So 1 paragraph each, where the first one is audience. You address the discussion that you're trying to enter with this paper. So who else is talking about this stuff that you want to contribute to this discussion? That's the audience. B is the bridge or the gap that exists in this literature. So the second paragraph in introduction, you're talking about what does not exist in the literature, right? So in a sense, the first paragraph you're addressing and naming, in a sense, your reviewers. So who could be knowledgeable reviewers? In the second one, you point out that there's something missing in the literature. The third paragraph is how you're filling this gap. So that's the contribution, right? C. And in the final 4th paragraph, D, is directions for new research, or the discussion that you think will continue and that you will create with your paper, right? So, and very often I see that introductions are not very helpful. They're not very structured. They're not very good at pointing out why what you're doing is important and what you're actually doing. So they're saying, oh, look at this, no one has combined these 2 ideas. Okay, great. Well, that's a gap. It's not a contribution, right? So combining 2 ideas is not a scholarly contribution. So you can combine 2 ideas that have nothing to do with each other, or combine 2 ideas that don't lead anywhere. That's not a contribution. So what you need to do is formulate and make it clear to the reader that this is what you're doing, and it's super important because, and be specific. Tell the reader that this is going to change everything. Obviously not everything, but it's going to change these things in a way that will make this type of research possible, or will solve these problems that we're having, or it will help practitioners in this specific way. Those kinds of things. And very often papers are really vague on this point. And to me, that should be a desk reject. If you can't tell the reader why your paper is important, basically, if you can't tell the reader why they should read your paper, then they shouldn't read your paper. And no one should publish that paper either, because you don't know what you're talking about, right? And unfortunately, I get, as a reviewer, since I'm on editorial review boards for a lot of those top journals, I still get papers where they don't really answer the so what question. So somehow the editors just let them pass through and then hope that the reviewers will catch that, I guess, which is a waste of time, because if the author cannot tell me why the paper is important, well, why should I tell the author? And why should I spend hours and hours trying to figure out what the heck they're talking about so that I can tell the author, you know what, you're actually talking about this, which is important, because rewrite the paper, please. I mean, it's better that I write that paper.
Yeah, true. As a reviewer, sometimes you feel, oh, I could write that paper better than what I've been given to review.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah. So my 4th question is, can you tell us about one Austrian Economics entrepreneurship paper that you're working on these days? How did you get the idea, where you are on that paper, and so on?
Well, I have plenty. And I have one on value that I desperately want to publish somewhere, but it's sort of, it's in a drawer somewhere. But there is one that I guess you could call it working on it. I've sort of outsourced the work right now to reviewers because it's under review. But it's one where we're extending the idea of subjective value into rationality. So there's a special issue of JBV coming, well, in a couple of years or something, on the concept of rationality. What do we mean by rationality? How does that affect entrepreneurship research? What does rationality mean for entrepreneurs? Which is an important question. And again, me and Mark, we have submitted a paper where it's under review now, the second round, where we're developing a subjective rationality concept, where we're talking about how rationality is really about a process of figuring out how to maximize your situation. Right, so I don't want to get too much into the details, but it's really the same type of project as the one that we talked about a minute ago in SBE, but where we're extending this idea. And I think that's something that is really important for grad students and junior scholars, to publish one idea that is sort of breaking a little bit of new ground, because you are the expert on that idea, and then you can extend it in different directions. So you can build your own research stream based on that one publication. Of course, it's super hard to get that publication actually accepted. I mean, asking someone like Sarah Sarasvathy, for instance, publishing her effectuation piece, she's talked several times about how super difficult it was, and that she needed to publish the empirical work first before she could get the theoretical piece even considered, basically, because it was so new. But we all know that, well, she has defined her career with the effectuation theory and that whole research stream. I mean, no one can publish anything in effectuation without citing her, which means that her paper is definitely going to be one of those, or already is one of those papers that is cited like a billion times, pretty much. And I mean, that's a good way of creating your own research stream. And I think that's Austrian Economics is really heavy on the theory. So what Mark and I are doing in our research stream is taking bits and pieces of Austrian theory and introducing it to entrepreneurship scholars. And we're doing that by redefining terms, by changing how we view theory, changing where theory leads us, and sort of offering a different framework for understanding entrepreneurship. And I think that is super important, but that's something I would not recommend anyone who has not received tenure yet, because theory only is super hard to publish.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do tell that to junior scholars, that I would discourage them from being, from doing AMR style theory papers because of how difficult they are to publish, especially as a junior scholar. So I'm glad you clarified that. And I'm looking forward to reading your next piece on value because of the reason I mentioned earlier. But there's a few questions from the audience, and I think it's time we take them now. So Sadek, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gupta. Dr. Bylund, I wanted to ask on your comment that you said when you have something not so popular, for example, in Austrian economics, we have the alertness approach. And if we are going against the alertness approach, is there a chance of desk rejection immediately? I mean, instead of alertness, if we find something like deliberate search and want to promote it, is there a chance of desk rejection immediately because it's not popular and it's not established in the literature as per my understanding? So I wanted to ask that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So unfortunately, our field is such that we cannot really critique. So coming from, I mean, being trained in economics, where economists hang out by trashing each other, basically, right? So when economists meet and discuss a paper, they try to find as many flaws as possible, and they only talk about the flaws. In order to get published in our discipline, it is you should always build on and always contribute to the literature, right? So if you try to write a paper and try to get it published where you critique someone, that is going to be very difficult, because what you critique, well, you're going to get reviewers who have knowledge in this area, and those would be reviewers who are probably building their careers on what you critique, right? So what you should do is not say that, oh, hey, look at that. Israel Kirzner was wrong, alertness sucks. Here's my new concept. Instead, what you should say is that there seems to be certain situations or certain entrepreneurs who rely on something that is a little bit different from alertness. Or there is this new other type of entrepreneur, say, or however you can tweak that and say that there seems to be something more, right? So in order to complete the picture, so not at all saying Kirzner sucks, not at all saying that alertness might not cut it, but instead say that there's more, right? So add to the picture. If you position your paper that way, it would be much easier to publish it. I'm not saying it will be easy to publish, but I'm saying that if you critique it, then you will get a lot of enemies before you get it published. And that's going to be really, really difficult. So try to be productive and constructive and add to it rather than withdraw from it.
Thank you.
Well said, Pad. We have another question from Mike Blackwell. Mike, do you want to go next?
Yes, I'll be happy to. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. I appreciate it. And Per, it's such a pleasure to see you again from our connection through Oklahoma State. I hope that you're having a nice day.
I am. Good to see you too.
Thank you so much, Per. I was curious to ask you, because you do so much work with the Austrian Economics, which is fantastic, and then you publish in mainstream media resources for businesses like Entrepreneur, just so much, which is incredible. How might you take like an article like how to make your startup an island from the Mises Institute? How might you take material from that's in all this Austrian context and then be able to bridge over to create an article that would be something you might publish in Entrepreneur?
Well, that's it's pretty easy, really. So Entrepreneur and these type of popular magazines, I mean, they're looking for something really simple. So the problem for us as scholars is to realize that we can't get everything right and we can't get all the nuances into one of those papers in Entrepreneur or in Forbes or whatever. Instead, it is one point, there's no context, and it should be something actionable, right? So you might have seen in Entrepreneur that you have, they're usually listicles rather than articles. So you have a little bit of an introduction, a couple of paragraphs, and then you have entrepreneurs should do this 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So that is the whole article, but that should be based on your knowledge. And as a scholar in entrepreneurship, you know a lot about entrepreneurship, and you can make those points easily. And then the first few paragraphs is basically just the positioning of those points that you want to make. Right. So many of the others who write for Entrepreneur who are not academics like myself, I mean, they're practitioners, so they take their own experience. So they say, oh, here are some things to think about when you're in HR, say, because they had problems hiring and firing people. And then they take basically what seems to us as random thoughts and experiences that they've had. And they just say, oh, here are 5 things about HR. And the only thing they have in common is that it has something to do with HR. Whereas for us, we can make a much more compelling case and much more interesting piece because we know the background, we know the theory, we know the questions to ask, right? So we can take one of those questions basically, and we can produce 4 or 5 answers and make it really simple. I mean, that's a hard part for us because we have sort of the curse of knowledge. We have so much background knowledge and we want to make everything exactly right, and we can't. So we need to oversimplify and then oversimplify a bit more.
Right.
And then we can get a piece. But it takes practice, and I think it's a good exercise because when you publish in newspapers and magazines like this, you need to make it very simple for the reader. You need to make sure that the reader understands what you're talking about, and it's exactly the same in scholarly papers. Right? So the so what question, very often people think they answer it because they have pointed out all these different papers that they've read and all these constructs and all these models and all this stuff.
Right.
And you read it and you go, what is this about? Right? So taking a step back and simplifying it for yourself and figuring out what is the actual story here. I mean, that helps a lot in your academic writing as well.
Thanks so much, Pro. Appreciate it.
Ashneet, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Professor Bylund, I have a quick question from you. It's like what helped you to avoid the desk rejects?
How do you avoid the desk rejects?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I knew. Is my short answer. Because the problem is that some papers that I think are really, really good get desk rejected. And some papers that I think, oh, this is going to be desk reject because the idea is not all that great. It suddenly goes through to the third round. So I think many senior scholars will tell you that the review process is sort of random. But it's there are some tweaks, and some of those tweaks are to find an editor who would know about your case or would know about your paper. Maybe contact the editor first and ask them if they think that this journal is actually a good journal for this paper, right? A good way of avoiding desk rejects is to not send empirical papers to AMR or send theoretical papers to AMJ. I mean, they don't fit at all, so you're going to get a desk reject. And I think when Jay Barney was editor for AMR, he said that most of the desk rejects are because people submit papers that are simply no fit at all, because they're empirical papers, and AMR is not an empirical journal, right? So know the journal you're sending it to, and make sure that you cite papers in that journal too, so that the editor sees immediately that, oh yeah, this is relevant for the discussions that are going on in the journal, right? So if you send a paper to a journal and you're addressing a new topic and you're not citing any papers from that journal, the editor is going to think, I'm not sure this is a good fit.
Thank you, sir.
And per sort of building on your answer, one of the reasons I decided to offer this virtual summer seminar is because I was hearing from a lot of editors that they're getting tons of papers that are desk rejected because they don't meet the journal expectations at all. And my concern when that happens is that means the people who are submitting those papers have no idea what kind of work gets published in these journals, which means then there's no point in submitting, and which is kind of what you reinforced.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I totally understand that we want to submit to a journal as soon as possible. I mean, I feel the urge to. But the problem is, if you've submitted to a journal and you got a reject there, that journal is gone. You cannot send it back there unless you rewrite the whole paper and change the story a bit, right? Which means it's a new paper. So it's really stupid in a sense to send it to a journal prematurely. So it does make sense to make those investments and check with an editor, check with someone who has published in that journal before, make sure to read the aim and scope of the journal, make sure that you do the formatting right and all this stuff. It's really boring and it seems like you're not doing anything because the research is done. But that extra week could be the difference between getting it published and accepted at a year later, or getting a desk reject. So it is important to know where you're sending the paper and make sure that it actually fits that journal.
Great, thank you. Vrinda, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gupta. And thank you, Dr. Bylund. It has been a wonderful discussion. I'll just extend the point a little bit more. As a scholar who's just starting out, I was wondering how to hone into a journal, because every journal seems to have a style. It seems to have a certain philosophy at the back. So as somebody who's starting out new, and I'm pretty blank about, I understand some, but not all of it. So where and how? Sorry for asking a silly question, but I need to know.
No, that's a great question, because I remember when I was in grad school, basically all the faculty said that, well, you need to find the journal where this discussion is going on and fit your paper in the discussion, and all the journals are different. And I read the journals and I was like, they're publishing the same people and they're publishing the same freaking things. I can see no difference whatsoever. It's just the names and the way the articles look. right? The font and stuff. But other than that, it seems like they're exactly the same. Well, it takes a few years of reading the journals, and then you realize that, oh, they're not the same, right? So I think one way of doing this is when you're writing a paper and you're going through and doing the lit review, then you should find that a lot of the papers that you cite seem to be clustered in one or two journals. Okay, so, and I'm talking about the theory, not the empirical part, but the theory needs to fit in those journals. And if you are citing all of those, say you're in a certain, you're talking about a certain concept, and of course it's all over the place, it's in all the journals, but then you find that some of these papers are more interesting than others, and you find that there are more papers in these journals that you are citing because they're much closer to your case and your argument. And then you basically look through the reference list for your own article and see, I seem to have a lot of papers published in AMR, but not in SMJ, say, right? Well, then your paper is probably better fit for AMR, and make sure that the tone and the language you use and the length of the article and everything it fits as well. But going by the references is sort of a shortcut. It's not always that it works. It doesn't necessarily work, but it's a way to get a start, right?
Thank you so much. That's so good. Thank you.
So Per, I know we told you 30 minutes and we are already at like 43 minutes, but if you don't mind, can we take 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay, so Indrani, you go next, and Aurobindo after that, and that's the end of questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Bylund. It was wonderful listening to you. So I'm from India, and if I talk about Indian economy, lot of work needs to be done at the grassroots level. If I talk about economic development of India, and I think the government is also in the process of doing all these things to encourage the micro and small medium industries. Now, my question is that when you evaluate a paper, do you evaluate a paper which is simply on the basis of research that has to be kept inside a journal, or do you look into the implementation part of it?
That's a good question. I would primarily look at the scholarly contribution of the paper. So some journals, they require that you also have sort of implications for practitioners or implications for policy. So if you do such research, then those journals would probably be journals to prioritize. Other than that, I mean, we're scholars writing for scholars. So a research paper should be for other researchers, and it should help other scholars to develop more research, and we're sort of in it for the knowledge, right? General universal knowledge, and then we're all teaching each other our findings, and we're sort of bringing that to the table, and then hopefully we get close to the truth. That's what we're doing. Now, the application of it is super important because the knowledge doesn't matter unless we apply it and actually use it in practice. So I agree with that. The issue is that would be more like like a policy brief or a white paper, unless you go to one of those sort of applied journals, like management science. I think would be one of those that is where you write for practitioners and scholars at the same time. But many of the other journals, I mean, AMR or JBV or whatever, you don't have practitioners reading those really. And if they would try, they would probably fall asleep. And if they don't fall asleep, they would just say, why is this relevant? Right? Because it's about details, it's about concepts, it's about theoretical framework, whereas they're trying to solve problems now, right? So I would try to focus on the research contribution first, and then as soon as you get it published, you can make it into a policy brief, or you can make it into a white paper, and you can use it like the previous question. You can use your contributions and write newspaper articles and say that, oh, I published this research, it's peer reviewed, which means no one can mess with you, right? No one can question. and then you say that this is my findings and this is what they should do. Right, but get the research published first.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Arvindo, do you want to go? You're the last question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the opportunity. So my question is basically to Parth about special issue and general issue from journal. Like journal have a priority area, and on the basis of priority area, they call for special issue on a salient topic or like that. So like if a paper is produced and it can be go for special issue, easy to publish, and also general, but special issue take long time. That means it whole processing take long time. So if one submit a paper to general issue and if it is rejected, then modify and submit it again to the special issue. Is it a wise decision or like that?
Yeah, it could be. I would generally suggest that early on in your career, you do not try special issues unless you already have a paper that is like a super fit. Because of what you said, the special issues, especially in the top journals, tend to take a lot of time, right? They have a call for papers and they say this will be published in 2 or 3 years. Well, as a junior scholar, you don't have that time. So you can't really wait for something to be reviewed forever and then eventually get rejected. So I would focus on regular submissions. But if you have had it rejected somewhere and you rewrite it for a special issue, and if you think it is a great fit, then the special issue is a great way of getting it considered. Because since a special issue is by definition on a narrow topic, so if you already have the research on that topic, it's obvious that the competition will be less than usual because most people don't have papers on that narrow topic. So submissions to special issues are typically fewer, I think, than to the regular issue. And in the regular issue, many of the top journals, they don't really care if they need to reject your paper, because that's actually good for them. Like the fewer papers that they accept, the better it is. And most of them, they do not have a lack of papers, right? So a journal is good if it has over 90% rejection rate, right? I mean, you can do them a service and contribute to that rate, but that's not doing yourself a service. For a special issue, for it to be published, they need a certain number of articles, and they are going to get many fewer articles submitted because it is on a narrow topic. I mean, if it is a good fit, and again, like the previous question, talk to the editors. I mean, if you think it is a fit, then email the editors and ask, and tell them that you have a paper that you think fits really well, and if that is what they have in mind, and ask them if they think it's advisable to submit it. They're not going to promise anything, of course. They're not going to say that, oh yeah, this is going to glide through peer review and you're going to get an accept. They're not going to say that, but they can tell you that, no, this is not a very good fit, or no, we don't really have this type of research in mind, or whatever it might be, right? So you can get an indication that way. And if they think that it might be a good fit, they're probably going to say that you should mention their name in the cover letter, so that they get to handle your paper. And that might help with reviewers because they've already heard your introduction very quickly, a couple of sentences of what the paper is about, and then they see the paper and then they go, oh yeah, that guy. So they might find better reviewers if you're lucky. I mean, it could help.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Parth. On that note, I would like to thank you for taking the time to talk to the participants of this virtual summer seminar in entrepreneurship research. We are very thankful that you were very patient in answering all the questions. The last question I have is, what is one advice you would offer to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers?
Get published. I mean, that's something that I think that anyone in our line of business would recommend you to do. But I think other than getting published, which is necessary, you need to work on your brand in terms of scholarship. So find your niche, just like entrepreneurs, really. Find your niche, find a gap in the research, find where your interest and your passions take you, become the expert, and then do research on that. Right? You might have to do some other papers too. I mean, and work with co-authors and just to get those pubs out there. But if you you're better off if you can define a field or define a type of study that people are going to, that's you, because you are the expert, right? So that's a long-term play, but that's important.
Great, thank you. And please join me in thanking Dr. Bylund for his time today. Again, I learned a lot, and I'm sure our students learned a lot too. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I'll stick around to answer any questions, but Dr. Bylund, you're free to log out whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you all. Good seeing you, Vishal.
Thank you. Take care, Perth. See you.
Bye-bye.